So the organizers asked me to give an introductory overview, so here's my attempt to deliver. I first want to set something straight. What do I mean by quenching? Okay, according to the dictionary, it means to put out or extinguish. I think when we're talking about quenching galaxies, we're not necessarily talking about completely bringing the star formation rate to zero. My definition simply is to make the galaxy transit from the blue cloud to the red sequence. So I'll follow that definition throughout. So I'll start by saying a few words about quenching demographics. Okay, where are the quenched galaxies living? Then say a few words about quenching mechanisms. How do you quench a galaxy? And then I'll focus on maintenance mechanisms, which is how do you keep a galaxy quenched when it is quenched. So quenching demographics, there's been a lot of work. Basically, Sloan made it possible to do this with way better than statistics than we had ever been able to do before. And a few things that we've learned from that is that the best indicator of being quenched, and I think most people now agree on that, is the central stellar surface density, or the Boucher-Disk ratio of a galaxy. Okay, this is from a paper by Joanne Wu, came out just a few weeks ago. This is halo mass inferred from a galaxy group catalog. This is the central surface density within 1 kiloparsec, and the color coding indicates the quench fraction. And what you can see, so this is only for central galaxies, that the color scales nicely with the central surface density. Okay. Another thing that we've learned from these kind of group catalogs is that satellite galaxies have a larger fraction of quenched galaxies than centrals of the same stellar mass. That is sort of shown here in this plot from Andrew Wetzel's work. Okay. And most of this dependency between satellites and centrals is what drives what some people call the morphological, the environment dependence of quenching. Okay. There is a second order effect, and that's that the quench fraction of satellites increases with the mass of the host halo. So this is a function of stellar mass. Okay, these are the quench fractions, and the colors are satellite galaxies of different halo masses. If you go to more massive halo, the quench fraction goes up. Okay. So quenching apparently is more efficient in more massive halos. That would be one inference, which is not the correct one. But, and finally, quench fraction of centrals increases both with stellar mass and halo mass. And again, causality is not necessarily implied here. Okay, you need to be very careful. I think the best indicator, as I said, seems to be Boucher-Disk ratio, not necessarily stellar mass or halo mass. Now, I want to spend 3 minutes talking about something that I call a miracle or a puzzle. It has to do with something that's age matching, and that has to do with trying to learn something about the demographics of quenched galaxies. As I presume most of you are familiar with the idea of abundance matching, where what you do is you go to a numerical simulation, rank order all the halos in the simulation according to halo mass, and then you put the brightest galaxy in the most massive halo, or the most massive galaxy in the most massive halo. And numerous people have shown that if you do that, you can very nicely fit the clustering of galaxies. And it's sort of shown here. This is from a paper by Andrew Heron and Doug Watson. These are the correlation functions of galaxies in different magnitude bins. The solid line is the correlation function that you get if you just do abundance matching of galaxies onto the halos in the simulation. Okay? But then the new thing, what they did was they did something called age matching, where now they go to that abundance matched mark, pick galaxies in a narrow bin of stellar mass or luminosity, go to Sloan and look at the color distribution of all those galaxies. And then for each of those galaxies in the simulation, they find the formation time of the halo in which that galaxy lives. And they rank order all the galaxies according to the formation time of that halo. Defined as basically whenever the halo reaches 50% of its final mass. And then they put the reddest galaxy in the oldest halo, the one that formed earliest. Okay, that's age matching, which you do at each different stellar mass bin. And out comes something that fits the observed clustering of red and blue galaxies brilliantly. Okay? It matches it very, very nicely. Not only that, they have gone on to show that it also reproduces the radial profiles of red and blue satellite galaxies in group catalogs. They have shown, and this is the most amazing part, that it even reproduces the difference between centrals and satellites. The fact that, as I said, centrals are more likely to quench than centrals, satellites are more likely to quench than centrals, comes out entirely naturally in this picture. It just comes from the fact that the central lives in a subhalo, and the subhalo, on average, formed earlier than the halo that hosts the central of the same stellar mass. Okay. It even matches galactic conformity, which is something that what people found, that there's a correlation between the star formation rate, or the quenchness of a central galaxy and that of its satellite population. that also comes out naturally. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, the only model that does that. So this extremely simple, naive way of linking galaxies to halos reproduces, as far as I'm concerned, everything we know about the demographics of these quenched galaxies. And this then raises the question, is this just a cosmic coincidence, or are we gaining some physical insight here? And if it is physical insight, then what we're learning is something really puzzling. We know for a long time that globally there is an anti-correlation between galaxy age and halo age, and that the most massive halos that assemble the latest host the oldest galaxies. Okay? So globally there is an anti-correlation. But what this claims is that at fixed stellar mass now, there has to be a very tight positive correlation between halo age and stellar age. And I have no idea how this would come about. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. So next I want to talk about some quenching mechanisms. And there's a long list of quenching mechanisms. You can separate mechanisms according to whether they operate on centrals or operate on satellites. And you can discriminate them between whether it's a mechanism that exhausts the fuel, whether it removes the fuel, it blows out the gas, or whether, if you like, it pollutes the fuel, which I mean, it basically renders a fuel inefficient in turning gas into stars. Okay, the list is definitely not exhaustive, so apologies if I'm missing something. And I don't have time to talk about all of them, so I'm going to pick out 3 that I'm quickly going to talk about, which, I think these are the 3 most interesting ones. The first one is halo quenching. The idea with halo quenching is that the quenching of a galaxy has something to do with the dark matter halo transiting from cold accretion to hot accretion, which happens at a halo mass of about 10 to the 12 solar masses. Okay? And Yuval Birnbaum here, who's here, has shown very nicely that that process by itself can actually quench a galaxy when it's around that halo mass, from about 10 to the 12 to 10 to the 13. The actual buildup of this hot atmosphere, when it transits into this hot accretion mode, itself can actually quench the galaxy. Okay? Now, there's only a narrow range of halo mass over which this works. If you go to more massive halos, you definitely need some maintenance mode to keep the gas from cooling. Okay? And we'll talk about that later on. But it is interesting that this process by itself might already do it. The only problem is that it doesn't explain by itself why you would have such a strong correlation between being quenched and you having a big bulge. Okay? So there needs to be something explanation there. Another mechanism that's very popular is quasar mode feedback. Okay, this is the form of AGN feedback, where the black hole is in a state where it's accreting at a very high rate, okay, close to Eddington. This is a highly radiative efficient accretion mode, and all this radiation comes out as a quasar, and if you can just tap into it, then you could just do something to the gas with quench. Okay. The great advantage of this method is that there's a natural link to merging. The idea is that whenever two galaxies, these galaxies merge, you drive a lot of gas to the center, and that will ignite the quasar mode. Okay? This therefore means that you have an automatic connection between quenching and the creation of the bulge of the spheroid. Okay? And any of the 1600 papers by Phil Hopkins, has very nicely demonstrated that this works very nicely. Okay? It's energetically feasible, there's no doubt about that, and there's observational support. We see winds coming out of quasars, high velocity winds. It's unclear how much mass is loaded onto those winds, but we see a lot of that stuff going on. The actual process, however, I would argue, is still very poorly understood, at least by me. Okay? And I think an issue is, for example, the idea would be, the simple calculations always assume it's radiation pressure that's driving the winds. Okay? But that's not necessarily how it's implemented in beautiful simulations like here by Matteo, 2005. Okay? Where basically the gas, 5% of the energy is just given as the thermal energy to the gas, and then you have a pressure-driven wind rather than a radiation-driven wind. Okay? And it's unclear whether that matters or not. But anyway, this is, I think, the favorite mechanism in most models and simulations. People are trying to implement it in simulations and in semi-analytical models, and largely motivated by the success that these simulations have. The next mechanism I wanted to talk about is morphological quenching, which was sort of brought forward by Martin Martic. The idea here is that bulge formation via a secular or a semi-secular process, or even by minor merging, can stabilize a disk against star formation. Okay? And she has shown in some simulation that that can lead to prolonged quenching. So what you see here from her simulation, the red is the gas fraction in the simulation, and the blue is the star formation rate. Initially, when the gas fraction goes up, the star formation rate goes up, and then at some point, the star formation drops to basically zero for almost 2-3 gigayears. Okay? Although the fact that the gas continues to build up, it's not forming stars, and that's just because something formed a very big bulge that stabilized the disk. Okay? I think this again has the advantage that it has a natural link between bulge dominance and quenching. Okay? It's a good thing. But again, some maintenance is required over the long term. You can see that here. Okay? The gas goes up, and at some point star formation kicks in, and this gas rapidly starts to turn into stars. So the quenching is only temporarily. But it might be the dominant quenching mode in low mass halos. Okay? In low mass halos, before you reach that hot mode accretion stage, this might be a mechanism that already could quench a significant fraction of the galaxies. So then let me now go to maintenance modes. And this is related to the well-known overcooling problem, also called the cooling flow problem, where if you have these hot atmospheres, okay, the idea is that you should have a cooling rates. In some of these clusters, cooling rates are predicted to go down to about 1,000 solar masses per year, but we don't see any of that. Okay? We don't see such high cooling range, which would imply high star formation rates, which would imply that the galaxies become extremely massive. Okay? We don't see any gas cooling down below about 1/3 of the virial temperature. So something seems to be providing some heating. The requirements for whatever process we invent to do that are that it suppresses the cooling rates, not necessarily it completely stops cooling, but it needs to bring it down at least by an order of magnitude compared to sort of the classically inferred cooling rates. Okay? So not necessarily zero, but the problem is you need to do that over cosmological timescales. Most people claim that you need to do that with a very detailed thermal balance, meaning that the cooling and the heating rates need to be very tightly coupled, okay? So that there's almost no net cooling. And that is suggestive of a feedback loop, the thermostat, okay? So that whenever the cooling for some reason increases, the heating reacts and goes up as well. And that is a very big problem for most of the processes, okay? Not all of them. The final thing is that the heat somehow needs to be distributed over large fractions of the volume and the mass in the central regions of those clusters. And again, that's something that's not always easily done. Again, there's a large number of processes that have been suggested, and again, this is not exhaustive in any way, but the most talked about one, I think, is the radio mode feedback, which again is a form of AGN feedback, but now one where we are in a low accretion regime, okay, where the black hole is not radiative efficient, but most of the energy is coming out in the form of kinetic energy, okay, in the form of jets. The claimed advantage of this mechanism, okay, that then does the heating, is that it has a feedback loop. Okay? The idea is that whenever the cooling increases, then more gas goes into the black hole and my jet becomes more powerful. So that's a great advantage of this method, but the problem is that feedback loop itself is extremely poorly understood. Right? You need to couple it over 9 orders of magnitude in scale. I don't know how many orders of magnitude in time scales. Most people invoke Bondi accretion, but it's entirely unclear whether that will work. Okay? Any little bit of angular momentum will screw it up. So I think a very, very big issue if we really want to advocate radio mode is that we need to better understand how that feedback loop actually works. Again, energetically it's certainly feasible, and it has observational support in the form of something like this here, beautiful image from Chandra of the Perseus cluster, where we see cavities. We see claimed shocks, we see claimed sound waves, I see ripples. But there's all sorts of stuff going on. It's clearly that an AGN is doing all sorts of stuff here, but exactly how that process works, I think, at least again, for me, I totally do not understand it. Okay? I do not understand how these jets, how these bubbles are supposed to heat up the gas over large volumes. Okay? The answer may well be that it's all about how exactly you arrange your magnetic fields and what cosmic rays contribute, and we'll hear talk about that later on in the week from Christoph. Again, it's a favorite mechanism in most models and simulations. Okay? It's like the standard ingredient in any semi-analytical model these days, and it's the only thing that people use basically to try and prevent galaxies from becoming too massive at the massive end. But there are a number of alternatives. One such alternative is gravitational heating. Gravitational heating in general, the idea is that you try to use some gravitational potential energy and use that to heat up the gas by basically making something fall into the center and then tapping into the kinetic energy, converting the kinetic energy through deceleration into thermal energy. And again, from the virial theorem, we know that this is energetically feasible because basically the thermal energy of the gas is basically set by the gravitational energy of the halo. The way is how are you going to do this? And the different scenarios and energy transfer mechanisms that have been proposed. One idea would be, for example, it's just dynamical friction acting upon all these galaxies and dark matter subhalos that are moving around. Okay? Dynamical friction will transfer momentum and energy from this subhalo and satellite galaxy to the dark matter and to the gas, but the sort of calculations that are done suggest that this is not sufficient. Okay? At least that's my take on it. Another idea comes from Andy Fabian, who suggested that maybe the cooling flow itself has some thermal instabilities. Some thermal instabilities make cold clouds, and these cold clouds now start sinking, falling into the potential well, and then the thermodynamic drag converts the original gravitational energy of those clumps into heat. Okay. I think an interesting idea was also put forward by Yuval and Avishai Deco, where the clumps that are coming in, the gas clumps, are not thermal instabilities, but they are coming from cosmological accretion. And basically what they argue is that if only about 5% of the baryons that you accrete are accreted in the form of cold clumps of gas that need to have a mass in the range of about 10 to the 5 and 10 to the 8 solar masses, then the hydrodynamic drag on those clumps could actually offset the heating. And in fact, here's the heating over cooling rate of unity. In this entire region here, they actually reach heating over cooling rates well above unity. So clearly there's enough energy there. In fact, this is the worry that you don't have a thermostat and you're starting to overheat. Okay? But then a very nice paper by Yuval in 2011 has shown that actually that's not a concern, and I think it had to do something with the fact that you're stirring some convection, and convection corrects that again. Okay? So you don't have to worry for overheating in this picture, and it's a very nice picture. The only thing you need to come up with is, okay, what would explain why 5% of the baryons are going to be in these cold clumps? Okay? I don't think it's ruled out, but it's not clear what to identify as those sources. Another very simple idea, of course, is conduction or heat diffusion. And the idea here is that you just have conduction working because basically all these cool core clusters basically have an inverted temperature profile. Okay? They're hotter on the outsides than the inner part. And so if you can just have a little bit of conduction, you could actually offset the cooling in the central part by just heat diffusion. The problem has always been that we believe that there are magnetic fields, or we know there are magnetic fields in this ICM, okay, and they're probably tangled. And original calculations had suggested that if you have a tangled magnetic field, the conductivity is going to be reduced about to 100 or 1,000 of Spitzer. But then a paper by Narayan and Medvedev showed actually that it's probably completely wrong, and that it actually is close to 1/3 Spitzer. Okay? And if that is the case, if you can actually reach conductivities, okay, of 1/3 Spitzer, and similarly, Gruzinov has shown that the viscosity can be 1/5 of the Brzezinski value. With those values for the conductivity and viscosity, you could actually have easily enough transfer of heat from the outer parts to the inner parts, either by conduction or by diffusion. The problem, of course, is that this does not have a natural thermostat, and some people argue that that therefore makes it very, very difficult to put things in hydrodynamic equilibrium. But there have always been papers, a very nice paper by Nadja Zakamska and Narayan, who have shown that assuming hydrostatic equilibrium and assuming that the cooling rate is exactly balanced by the conductive heating rate, you can put things in hydrostatic equilibrium with energy density profiles and temperature profiles. So this is data, and the black line are her models that actually fit that data. Okay? It works for some clusters, definitely not all, okay? Because in some clusters you need much more conductivity than what you can get out of these magnetized plasmas, but it seems that it's certainly a viable alternative. The key, though, to make all this stuff work is turbulence. And the reason is that in these cool core clusters, you have all sorts of buoyancy instabilities operating, and what they tend to do is they tend to align the magnetic field so that they basically are perpendicular to the radial direction. And that basically would prevent any conduction from going, okay, across the magnetic field lines. So you need to have a mechanism that keeps stirring up these magnetic fields, okay, so that basically they are tangled in the central core region. And the idea is that a turbulence might simply come from the galaxy motions themselves, okay, which will fly through the gas with speeds. And there's a nice paper by Luskowski and O that show that basically should be enough to give enough turbulence to make this conduction work efficiently. Finally, the last mechanism I wanted to talk about is AGB heating. This is a very new idea, well, not a new idea, but basically it was revived in a very recent paper by Charlie Conroy. The idea here is that when you have planetary nebula, or the late stage of AGB stars, that they blow out planetary nebula, the star, and therefore the ejecta, will have a net velocity with respect to the hot gas, just coming from the velocity dispersion of stars in the galaxy, and therefore there will be a hydrodynamic drag on that ejected material, and that could actually thermalize the ambient gas. Okay? And they show that basically...
Totally wrong, Frank.
Sorry?
Totally wrong.
I agree with you that it's totally wrong. I actually think that the problem is what I didn't take into account is the fact that that ejected material then later on will turbulently mix. Okay? And if you bring it back to the temperature, if you have to raise that gas up to the temperature of the ambient medium, that exactly balances basically the amount of heat you put in. So it doesn't do anything. But the question is whether that ejected material does heat up to the ambient gas temperature. If it doesn't, if it stays in cold clumps, and there's a paper by Joel Begelman here who has shown that, at least in their simulations, it not necessarily always goes into the hot gas phase, then this might be a mechanism that should be considered. So that's all I wanted to say about that. So let me then summarize. I think quenching of centrals becomes more likely with increasing halo mass and stellar mass, okay, and with increasing bulge mass and central surface density. And causality is hard to infer here, but I think most people are now betting that the bulge mass central surface density is a better indicator than anything else. And I tend to agree with that. We also know that satellite quenching is more efficient than central quenching, so that basically means that people have invoked additional processes that quench satellites, like ram pressure stripping and harassment and whatnot, strangulation. But then comes this stuff with the age matching, which basically says if you just assume that all that matters for quenching is the age of your halo, you don't need to do anything special to the fact that that satellite galaxy crossed the virial radius at some point. That already explains all the demographics. That's why I call this a miracle or a puzzle. Okay? Because apparently that works better than anything I've ever seen without invoking any mechanisms that have to do with you being a satellite. There's no shortage of quenching or maintenance mechanisms. Okay? I listed here a bunch of them, and I talked about some of them. AGN feedback is definitely the most popular one. Okay? Energetically, it's possible. There's definitely enough energy, but we don't know how it is used. And that ignorance of understanding basically means that it's ideal for the models and the simulators. They just put it in and they just tune the way that they tap into that energy in the way that they want. That has given AGN feedback that anything goes now feedback name. And I really am very skeptical about this entire AGN feedback picture. I'm really interested to hear and people convince me that that's how it works. I think a very important question is, are any of the alternatives viable? Perhaps they all contribute. After all, it's just physics. None of these things are unphysical, so they should all be operating at some amount of level. I think the biggest argument against most of the other ones is that they lack this thermostat, they lack this feedback loop. Although again, I still don't understand how that feedback loop is supposed to operate for the AGN. Okay? And finally, and I think this is an interesting thing that I would like to put up for discussion, is do we really need that detailed thermal balance, a thermostat, over gigayear timescales? Okay? The reason why I'm not certain about that is, if you look at cool core clusters, they're not all of them. They're also non-cool core clusters. And maybe they're just manifestations of one and the same phenomenon, just seen at different times. Which basically means that a cool core cluster can evolve into a non-cool core cluster and go back over gigayear timescales. Or perhaps we see that in some brightest cluster galaxies, we see star formation rates that are well in excess of 100 solar masses per year. Clearly, in some cases, there is gas cooling out at very significant rates. So I think there's a lot of variance from one system to the other, and therefore I'm not sure that we really need a very detailed thermal balance. Okay? And that basically then means that the feedback loop that we're talking about doesn't have to be as tight. And thank you for your attention.
So, questions?
The age matching for the satellites, could that also explain
the observations of satellites in massive clusters, or did they not include massive clusters?
Yes. When you do that, you basically reproduce the radio profile, the number densities, the fractions of quenched galaxies, anywhere from the most massive groups, like clusters, all the way down to the Milky Way size halos. So there's nothing, as far as we can tell, that doesn't work. And very nice, this galactic conformity may actually be a really important, crucial point. People have shown that there are correlations between star formation rates of galaxies, not only within a halo, and that if the central galaxy is quenched, the satellite is more likely to be quenched than when the central is not quenched. That's a galactic conformity that Wyman identified. Kaufman then found conformity on much larger scales, on megaparsec scales. And if you look at a quenched central of a given mass, you look at its environment, it overall will have an elevated quenching factor. That again comes out naturally in this picture where a certain halo forms earlier because it lives on an overdense region, so all its halos around it form earlier. And all this thing comes out really, really beautifully.
So also, not only that, but also far within the virial
Far within the virial, the radial profile down to 10 gigaparsec. So if you just say whenever your halo reaches a certain age you quench, you do better than anything else I've seen. I'm not saying there's a causal connection, but that's why I call it a puzzle.
Yeah, about the AGB story, another point about that is that they are just injectors in situ into the IGM, and that's the primary coolant. And this range of temperatures, you've got more than 10 to the 6 Kelvin. So they're really going to score on goal. They're going to make the thing cool. I don't know whether that was in the paper. I'm not familiar with this paper, but that's something
No, I think the idea there is simply, they basically assume, in their paper, that 100% of the kinetic energy of ejected AGB envelopes is converted into heat. That's basically the assumption they make.
But you're putting dust particles into the IGM, and then the plasma in the IGM inelastically collides with those dust particles. It takes the heat out of the IGM. You only need
I'm glad you're skeptical about it. Let's put it that way. I think you make a very good point, that it might actually be a coolant.
I mean, if you
I think
coolant, that's a great way of doing it.
I agree, for the same reason that it said that if you want to turbulently mix it and bring it to the temperature of the ambient medium, that costs a lot of energy.
Other questions?
Is there a scale over which the galactic conformity should break or no longer work?
So we're actually working on a bunch of papers on this and trying to do it. We see it out to scales of like up to 10 megaparsec scales. Okay? That's sort of the largest scales of sort of the overdensities in which you expect some correlations. But you see it over very large scales.
Last question?
Does the efficiency of quasar mode feedback depend on the merger mass ratio? Do you have a feeling for?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm sure that people play with that in their modeling, but I don't think anyone from first principles can answer the question.
Okay, thank you very much.